welcome to those of you who are here in person and to those online. We're here to present the new 2023 Microeconomic Report, Rethinking Urban Migration Policy Options for Cities in Latin America and the Caribbean. The starting point for this report is recognizing the fact that our economies are lagging behind relative to other regions. In particular, productivity growth in our region has been among the slowest in the world, almost contributing nothing to GDP growth in the past 70 years. Therefore, it is imperative to embark on a new path and with a new strategy. The regions that are highly productive are supported by competent workforces. The good news is that our region still has that. Younger workers still have many productive years ahead and vast potential to produce, to work, to consume, which means that we have a capacity to improve the elusive economic growth, which is something that our countries deserve and our citizens too. But this demographic dividend is not eternal. We are witnessing a decrease in birth and mortality rates, which leads to forecasting population aging over the next few decades. In addition to the significant challenges we face in terms of developing skills among our youth and workers in the face of the energy and technological transitions we are now witnessing. Despite educational progress, the quality of education is still far behind the standards of more developed countries. This is why it is so important to highlight the fact that worker productivity is not only related to human capital as such, but also to the setting in which they work. It is remarkable to see how workers with similar skills can exhibit very disparate productivity levels across different economies. So we definitely need to take into account the individual circumstances that will catalyze national growth in order to foster competition and the sharing of innovative ideas. And urban migration may be a key factor, since it may help us reassign young, ambitious workers from less productive areas to areas that offer more opportunities. And the idea is to improve not just the productivity of workers in cities, but also to provide new opportunities to develop other skills. But of course, urban migration presents significant challenges, which have been the subject matter of the work of academics and policymakers globally. Migration, especially towards urban areas, opens up a range of opportunities and could be one of the key factors for sustained economic growth going forward. In rethinking urban migration, we seek to harness the potential by offering concrete policy actions for decision makers across the region, seeking to maximize opportunities and tackle the challenges inherent in the inflow of migrants. It is vital to expand the debate on urban migration, because without strategic policy interventions, the opportunities could not materialize. In fact, the slow productivity growth in the LAC region suggests that urban migration hasn't yet unlocked its full potential. We trust that this new report will help turn our urban migration dividend into increased regional productivity and prosperity in the years to come. Before concluding, I would like to express my acknowledgement to the team that worked on the Microeconomic Report for Latin America and the Caribbean, which is a tradition. This was coordinated by Matias Busso and Juan Pablo Chabin from the IDB Research Department, also Paul Carrillo from GW University, he's here with us, and we also had the valuable support of Antonella. So thank you very much for that work too. And this was prepared by the Research Department. We have two strategic partners, the Migration Unit and the Housing and Urban Development Unit of our bank. Special thanks go to Felipe Munoz, head of the Migration Unit, and to to Tatiana Gallego-Lison from the HUD division. Thank you very much for your support. And I would also like to thank Marcelo Escobares from USAID, who will be joining Tatiana and Felipe during the conversation panel following the presentation of the macroeconomic report. We take great pride in the report, which rigorously deals with a complex issue such as migration, and we are very thankful for the cooperation we had at all levels and from all areas. We are reaffirming our commitment as the IDB group to build a better future for the region. Together, we are making a difference. Thank you very much. Now, I would like to turn it over to Matías Buzo for him to kick off the presentation. Matías, the floor is yours.
Bueno, buen día.
So, good morning, and thank you once again for joining us for the launch of the 2023 macroeconomic report on rethinking urban migration, also with a focus on the policy options for local governments to try and take advantage of the opportunities that arise. We worked on this with Juan Pablo Chauvin, Paul Carrillo from GW University. I would like to thank them, and I would like to echo Eric's acknowledgement of the work done by Tatiana and Felipe from HUD and the migration unit. Their teams engaged in great, useful cooperation. And thanks, Antonella, as well, for the great work. Without you, we would have no report, I dare say. Thank you. The phenomenon of migration has appeared in newspapers across the region for decades, and it's usually associated with crisis situations, from displaced persons who need to leave their homes due to violence, such as in Colombia, or families that had to find new places to live due to hurricanes, the case of Mitch in Honduras, or floods in Paraguay, Argentina, Brazil, wildfires in Bolivia, and certainly climate change will exacerbate the phenomenon of migration towards cities in the coming decades. And there have also been major international migration flows, such as in recent years with migration from Venezuela, which has been witnessed in several countries across the region. And these internal and international migration processes have been significant and costly to the migrants themselves, to the places of origin, the cities they've left behind, and in some cases also for the receiving cities. But in this brief, concise report, we somehow try to focus on other aspects related to migration, which are not as frequently taken into account, in order to expand the view on two levels, including migrants who leave their homes through their own free will because they seek better opportunities in the destination countries. And we stress the challenges and opportunities attached to the phenomenon of migration. And this latter point, opportunities, which Eric also highlighted in his introduction, is not minor, because Latin America has exhibited slow economic growth due to low productivity increases. Cities are a source of productivity growth creation through innovation, sharing of ideas, agglomeration, economies, and the interactions between and among individuals, in addition to the larger markets of goods and services. And migration also helps city population grow, and especially internal migration reallocates individuals from low productivity to high productivity places. Now, the opportunities must also be weighed up against the challenges. Sudden, large-scale migration of individuals arriving into a city might pose challenges to the job market, jobs and wages, especially among vulnerable populations, might suffer. There's increased housing demand, which leads to rising prices or the expansion of informal settlements. Now, what do you need to make the most of the opportunity and to mitigate the challenges? Well, to a great extent, this depends on public policy, as we signal in the report, and to a great extent, the work focused on attempting to identify ways in which public policies could actually lift the barriers to harness opportunities. The report contains 4 chapters. The first one deals on migration and cities. The second one looks at how the labor and housing markets adjust to the migration flows. And finally, we issue policy recommendations. The report looks at all migrants who are essentially internal. But of course, there are also considerations related to international migrants. We focus on the destination cities, and as part of the report, we have also produced and looked at new data and reviewed the literature. I will tell you a bit more about the data soon. So let me tell you about urban migration, and then Juan Pablo will deal with the opportunities and barriers to take advantage of the opportunities in order to then discuss the policies as well. Latin America is a region that has historically exhibited high degrees of urbanization. The population's share living in cities continues to grow even today. And urbanization continues to grow across all countries in the region. We are even more urban than countries or regions with similar development levels. And in the report, we did painstaking work first to identify what a city is based on the lighting levels observed at night. We didn't look at the administrative classifications in censuses or surveys in order to define cities. And secondly, we did very thorough work to identify migrants in household surveys and among others. And then we double-checked the information, looking at the census information as well. And this was important in order to define who was a migrant and who was not. The graph on the left-hand side shows that in normal times, the migration received by cities is usually internal. So migrants within countries who move from one city to another, rather than international migrants. But as I said earlier, in recent times, the number of international migrants has included tremendously across countries in the region. And one assumption we have when we look at migration and urban migration, we think that migrants only go to the large cities. But we find that actually cities of all sizes receive migrants, and all of them receive large shares of migrants relative to their initial population. So we hope the report will prove useful to a large number of public policymakers locally, not just the mayors of large cities in the region. Where do migrants live when they arrive in cities? Generally, they demand less housing than the locals, and they usually tend to have a different amount of informal housing. You can see the X is the average number of rooms in the homes of residents, and the 45-degree line shows each city as a dot, and you can see that in nearly all cities, migrants tend to live in smaller homes than the established residents. And something similar is found across a number of housing attributes. So migrants usually demand less housing, and they're usually more in informal settlements. Plus, they usually tend to own less. They are much more present in the rental rather than real estate purchase market. Now, the graph on the right-hand side shows that the housing ownership rates, according to migration status, shows that residents tend to be owners much more than migrants. Now, if you look at the labor market, migrants do better. They have higher labor market share rates, they have similar employment rates to those of residents, and they even have slightly higher wages than residents. Probably this points to higher human capital levels. Now, there are some exceptions. I will note two of them. Women migrants usually fare worse than men who are migrants. They have more informality, more unemployment, and less market share. There are more hurdles for women migrants to participate in the labor market. And it also depends on the migrant type. Displaced migrants are different to non-displaced migrants, those who choose to leave on their own as opposed to those who are forced to do so. The blue and light blue bars show the informality rates, employment and wages, and the differences. You will see that for non-displaced migrants, the figures are lower than for the yellow bars who are displaced migrants, for example, those displaced due to prolonged drought in their communities in Brazil. So they suffer from higher informality, less employment, and poorer wages. We also looked at the impact of migration on the destination communities, and what we've found is that generally the effect is very slight as far as the labor market is concerned. Migrants arriving don't on average very much affect the local labor market variables vis-a-vis the established residents. But the literature also seems to agree that more vulnerable residents do suffer labor market losses, especially in the shorter term. So, in order to wrap up, I will give the floor to Juan Pablo, who will discuss the opportunities afforded by urban migration, the hurdles to take advantage of the opportunities, and the public policy issues.
Muchas gracias, Matías.
Very well, thank you very much, Matías. Good morning, all. And as Matías already prefaced, this report suggests that migration is a great opportunity for the cities of destination. But where do the opportunities actually come from? To begin with, migration includes urban concentration, and we know that that tends to improve the productivity of both workers and businesses. This graph shows a positive correlation between city population and average wages in cities in Mexico and Brazil, which shows that more populated cities tend to be more productive. Of course, these are simple correlations we are showing here, but there's actually a large body of scientific research that uses several productivity measures, not just wages, and that shows that this is a causal relationship. So agglomeration tends to make workers more productive. This is what we refer to as agglomeration economies. When a city has twice the population of another, it tends to be 2 to 4 times more productive. Another source of opportunities has to do with the fact that, on average, migrants tend to have more schooling rates than the local residents of the destination cities. And this graph shows the share of people in working age who have at least high school education, and you can see the difference between residents and migrants. Cities above the 45-degree line are cities in which migrants on average have higher schooling rates and education rates than the locals. So in these cities, migration raised the schooling rate average in the city. And this is an important opportunity because more highly qualified workers are not just more productive, but they also tend to make other workers more productive. In fact, cities that have a higher average schooling rate at a certain point in time tend to grow more rapidly in subsequent years. Another source of opportunity is related to the fact that urban migrants in our region tend to be on average 6 years younger than the local urban dwellers. And this graph shows that out of every 100 urban migrants support a larger number of dependents as opposed to the locals. So, there's not just the fact that urban migrants have more productive years ahead, but they also have additional resources which may go into saving, investment, and also consumption in their cities of origin, where they support dependents. And there are also there are other interesting sources of opportunities because migrants consume and demand more goods and services, which also stimulates demand in the cities of destination. They also need housing, so that also stimulates the building industry. And also, as Matthias said, migration helps improve the spatial distribution of labor across the board, because typically reallocates people from low productivity areas to areas where there are more opportunities and where the markets are not stagnant, for example. And this creates more opportunities across the board. And as we've said, this is not just about opportunities. There are also significant challenges that need to be considered, such as greater labor market competition, especially for the more vulnerable local residents. And there might be an increase in housing costs in the communities of destination. And there may also be a proliferation of informal settlements. So it's important to consider this and to make an effort to mitigate these challenges. Now then, the fact that opportunities associated with migration exist is no guarantee that the opportunities will materialize, because constraints also exist, barriers that may make those opportunities underused. So what can we do in order to maximize the benefits to be had from migration? That's very important in order to target policy interventions. And in the report, we discuss several of the barriers. Allow me to refer briefly to 4 of the main ones. First barrier has to do with access by migrants to the most densely populated areas in the region. So agglomeration economies are stronger in shorter distances, so where the businesses and workers can interact more regularly. The fact is that being in a city is no guarantee that you'll be able to regularly interact with other people in the city. Many of us know that in Latin America, especially, the low-income neighborhoods tend to be far away from city centers, which limits their access to more productive labor markets. And frequently, migrants, given that in these districts the housing costs are lower, end up settling down in many of these more remote areas, which restricts their access to these economic opportunities. Another set of constraints has to do with the fact that migrants have fewer connections in their cities of destination as opposed to local residents. And having a network of contacts, friends, and relations can be vital in order to have a recommendation for a job, or to get someone to be surety for a rental agreement, or to get help in case of some financial contingency. That can also be invaluable when it comes to caring for children or others. And migrants have less access to all of these advantages as compared to the local residents. which places them at a disadvantage when it comes to participating in the local economy. And this disadvantage especially afflicts women migrants. Due to traditional gender roles, they end up taking over more of these traditional tasks, and this relates to what Matthias said. It's consistent with the fact that women migrants, as we see, don't fare that well in the labor markets as men do. One third significant restriction when it comes to making the most of migration opportunities has to do with the underused skills of migrants, which you'll see on this graph that in many countries in the region, migrants tend to be more accepting of jobs that are below their level of qualifications and skills as compared to the local residents. 18% of migrants who have a high school education or higher tend to be employed in jobs that are in the lowest quarter of the scale of jobs compared to the residents, which creates a double prejudice in that we are not taking advantage of this human talent available, but also we are creating additional competition on the labor market for the local less skilled workers. And another key restriction, of course, has to do with the limited housing options that migrants have, especially for the short term. The rental housing market, which, as Matthias said, is very important, in particular for migrants, is less developed in Latin America and the Caribbean as compared to other regions around the world, which means that rent is more expensive in our cities. And this is particularly true when we look at homes that offer all of the basic utilities. The cities in Brazil that have these homes with the all of the basic utilities tend to have more high-priced rental. And you will see that increased demand for housing leads to 4% increase in the rental price of these houses that have all utilities. And this has an impact on the homes that don't have the utilities. So you will see that there's a correlation also in terms of the price increase. So this leads to incentives for migrants to end up settling down in informal settlements where they have less access to the job market.
A parte final desse relatório, o questionamento que fazemos é o que significa todas essas oportunidades e as restrições do aproveitamento das mesmas. O que significa isso para os legisladores da América Latina e do Caribe, principalmente para aqueles que trabalham a nível nacional. Os resultados deste relatório nos permitem identificar resultados específicos que a política pública deveria tratar. Primeiramente, o primeiro objetivo, de maneira geral, que nós mencionamos, é promover a contribuição dos migrantes na economia e da produção local. Dentro desse objetivo, dentro dessa visão mais ampla, tem 4 objetivos específicos. Primeiramente, o objetivo de buscar facilitar a integração dos migrantes às áreas mais densas de cada cidade, assim podendo capturar os benefícios das economias desses locais. Segundo lugar, o objetivo de aproveitar o capital humano dos migrantes, de que essas capacidades sejam devidamente aproveitadas. E o terceiro seria usar o perfil demográfico, jovens, disponibilidade, e claramente o objetivo de buscar mitigar os possíveis impactos negativos que a migração pode ter, principalmente para os grupos mais vulneráveis. Outro mais geral é tentar limitar aquelas lares sem condições, buscando melhorar a capacidade de resposta das cidades ao aumento da demanda de moradia a curto prazo, mas também buscar melhorar a disponibilidade das moradias a longo prazo. O relatório também também aborda várias políticas ou opções de políticas específicas com base na evidência científica poderiam ajudar as cidades a avançarem nestes objetivos. Claramente não temos tempo aqui para discutir todos em detalhes, mas gostaria de compartilhar duas mensagens-chave. Primeiramente, as soluções mais adequadas dependem das circunstâncias específicas de cada cidade e exige um esforço deliberado dos fazedores de políticas para escolher, ou seja, também adaptando as alternativas de políticas públicas mais coerentes. Segundo lugar, as políticas que podem de fato aproveitar essas oportunidades da migração tendem a ser políticas que beneficiam a população como um conjunto, a todos, não apenas os migrantes. E isso é muito importante, pois ajuda a conseguir os acordos políticos que são muitas vezes necessários para levar a cabo essas iniciativas. Agora aqui dou exemplos. O objetivo geral para ter a contribuição dos migrantes para o crescimento da produtividade econômica, temos ali políticas para fomentar a aglomeração efetiva, o investimento no transporte, em relação também ao tamanho dos edifícios, o ordenamento urbano, e também ter a participação uma integração no mercado de trabalho, apoio com creche, enfim. E o objetivo também de aliviar essas limitações de moradia, temos políticas que buscam maximizar essas moradias já existentes de custo baixo, com base em soluções que sirvam entre pontes da oferta e a demanda, ou políticas para poderem impulsionar moradias para longo prazo dentro de uma política de urbanização da cidade que considere as futuras moradias em função do fluxo migratório. Gostaríamos de concluir destacando 4 mensagens-chave. Primeiramente, a solução para o problema da baixa produtividade de certas economias da América Latina e do Caribe permeia pelas sociedades, ou seja, nas sociedades produtivas chave para o crescimento da economia nacional. Em segundo lugar, a migração é uma fonte de oportunidade para alcançar esse objetivo, ou seja, o objetivo de melhorar a produtividade dessa cidade. Em terceiro lugar, essas oportunidades poderiam ser desperdiçadas caso não tenhamos as políticas públicas que vão assegurar-nos que estamos aproveitando essa oportunidade. E quarto, essas políticas que podem nos ajudar a aproveitar essa oportunidade, em sua grande maioria, são políticas que geram benefícios diretos não apenas para os migrantes, mas como para a comunidade como um todo. Então, gostaria de convidar a todos que, por favor, baixem o relatório
URL and please read it.
Disponible en español,
It is already available in Portuguese, Spanish, and English. So thank you so much for your attention and for joining us today. I will now turn it over to Eric again.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much,
Muito
Matias
obrigada,
and Juan
Matias e
Pablo,
Juan
for this
Pablo, pela sua
presentation.
apresentação.
This is
Essa
just
aqui é
the
a
tip of
ponta
the
do
iceberg,
iceberg.
however.
Apenas
Only
aqui
a few
alguns
data
dados que
that
eu
I
pessoalmente
found quite
considerei
interesting,
muito
but
importante, além
there are
de
so many
vários
more
outros,
that can help us understand
para compreender
the
pouco
migration
mais o
process better
processo
and its
migratório que
impact
tem
on
essa.
cities. So I would like to invite you to read it. No excuses. There are no excuses. It's available in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. So it's available to all. And I would like to congratulate the coordinators, including Paul, for this effort that was made. And I'm so proud of this piece of work that we are presenting today. Now it's time for a discussion. And I would like to invite the panel members, Marcela, Tatiana, and Felipe, to come here and join me at the front of the room so that we can talk about future challenges posed by migration and the impact on cities.
Tengo que decir, por favor.
And please, Felipe, in the middle, if you will.
Tengan sus
And here are your microphones. Please use them. We always say that we have the best high quality panelists with us. And this is an opportunity when that is more than true because of their experience and their commitment. I mean, they're top of the line. They are the ones who are best versed in migration and cities. So we are so lucky to have them. Two of them are in-house. They're from here, from the bank, and one is a very close friend of ours. And let me introduce them briefly. I'm sure that you all know them, but just so you have this information, Marcela Escobar is in charge of the Latin America and Caribbean office at USAID, and she is leading efforts to have a collaborative response to this historical displacement in Latin America and Latin America. Thank you. Tatiana Gallego-Lizon is the head of HUD at the IDB. She used to be the director of the Water and Urban Development at the Asian Bank for Development. And Felipe Munoz is the head of the Migration Unit at the bank. He was a presidential advisor on the border between Venezuela and Colombia, and he was in charge of working with migration flows on that border. So this is the very high quality panel that we have today. I'll start with Marcela with a general question about the extensive work you're doing on migration and how to promote the insertion of migrants in urban areas. As we all know, and as we heard from Matias and Juan Pablo a few minutes ago, we know of the impact on cities. And the question is, what can cities do to adjust to this and turn the inflow of migrants into an opportunity for progress? Thank you. Thank you for this invitation. I usually meet you abroad, so thank you so much for allowing me to just cross the street and come to the IDB. You have the best snacks, really. And today, I must tell you that I ate cuñapé. It's not pão de queijo. It's from Bolivia. And since we are at the center of Latin American know-how, I think it's important for you to know what I'm talking about. But it was delicious, and it's such a great opportunity to be here with you and talk about this. Congratulations on this report, really. First of all, for the methodology, the quality of the data. We talk about this a lot. There's a lot of literature available out there, but you do provide us with so much input for the region.
Sí, el momento es clave.
This is a key juncture, and what is very important here is that and please excuse my Spanglish, and hopefully my mom won't be watching this because I don't work in Spanish as much as I should, so it's a bit contaminated. It really goes above and beyond, and it disbanks certain myths. And the truth is that urbanization is good and migration is good as long as the conditions are set. And we talk about the type of migration that we have experienced more often than not, which is internal migration. In Latin America, we're still under-urbanized, and that's important to know and to be taken into account when making policy. And the shock that we experienced over the last 5 years is a bit different. We're talking about 7.7 million Venezuelans who were displaced, and that's when these shocks come, planning becomes more difficult, xenophobia becomes more pressing, and we need to work even harder for these policies to really be developed and put in place and leverage this actually human tragedy, which is displacement due to regional crisis, as an economic plus. And one thing that I'd like to talk about that we have been watching very closely at USAID, which is our greatest mission in Colombia, is the example of Bogota. Just like many other cities, when the massive inflow of Venezuelans arrived, most cities says, no, this is as far as we can go. This is the responsibility of the central government. And there was actually a complete change of course with the outgoing mayor of Bogota, who said, listen, we either face this pragmatically, and we're all in, or else we will not come out in a good situation out of it. And it's become a model, a role model in the region. We know that the costs are short in the short term, and they're to be paid, the political costs, the economic costs, etc. But as the IMF said, 4.5% of GDP, that's how much will be gained thanks to migrants, and that's over 10 years. But what Bogota is showing is that when you implement these policies proactively, you can start seeing benefits immediately. And the only figures that I wanted to share with you, because I was there a month ago when the policy was launched, it's a 12-year migration policy. Who does that? Even us in the United States. The longest we can go is do that TPS for 2 years and then renew it or expand it, because politically it's very costly. And as you very well know, Colombia has a 10-year policy. Bogota has a 12-year policy with $600 million being invested into it. So you need to change the law to change what they're doing. And they have 9,000 new businesses created by migrants, 188,000 new jobs created for Colombians by migrants. And so the cost to the budget has started turning around, because when they start working, when the public policy starts eliminating all of the hurdles, apparently there are about 40 obstacles that had to be eliminated to be able to have job incorporation and insertion. You see that these migrants are paying for their own healthcare, and they're not a burden on the budget. So looking at these policies real time as they're happening and being able to promote them for the rest of the cities is so important. But that's what I had to say. That's the example that I wanted to share with you. Excellent example, actually, because at the end of the day, it helps us understand that this report will help us bring down many myths. And that's a very important example, a very specific example of how to implement strategic policies to face these challenges and turn them into opportunities. And we see a net benefit for countries, and Colombia is a clear example of that. That's the main message, and that's a message that goes to other types of public policy reform, and that's the issue of going over the medium term. It's hard to plan beyond the political cycle, and this is an excellent example of medium-term and long-term planning. Felipe, along those lines, my question has to do with that shock that Marcela referred to in terms of migrant inflows into urban centers. The question is, what can governments do to facilitate better integration and insertion of migrants into labor markets? And can something be done to foster entrepreneurship amongst migrants? First of all, thank you, and thank you to the whole research team, and thank you for helping us support this process, because this underusing human capital, and also there's competition in the lower strata, which may be unfair. We need also for migrants to have access to job placement services and improve skills. Also, in terms of demand, we need to work with businesses. We just spoke to the authorities in Bogota, and many businesses are afraid of hiring migrants. They're afraid of the regulations. They're afraid of the issue of they're loath to use people on temporary permits. And also there is the national level government. But we need to continue to make efforts to legalize migrants. We have several countries that we've been working with, and we need to update regulatory frameworks. We had a regional dialogue with over 16 countries, with people working with employment, with labor markets and migration authorities. And in certain countries, there's still quotas for the percentage of migrants at a business, but these date back to 40 or 50 years ago. So, and that must be acknowledged. So we have the evidence, and we have the capacity operationally to start working on this in greater detail and more specifically focused on urban areas to go to overcome the 5 challenges. First of all, there is the numbers, the figures. We need need to have better information about the issue of migration in the short term. People who have migrated in Latin America will stay where they've settled. Some others say that they're going to go back home. They're not really looking at the figures. Then skills to improve the situation of migrants, to improve the labor market, local capacity building, as in the case of Bogota, but São Paulo is another case in point. They have a very interesting integration process. The same goes for Buenos Aires and many others, and inclusive urban growth. Thank you. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Felipe. You brought up very interesting ideas, especially about the way units at the IDB supplement each other and complement each other with their work. It's a complex issue that is being broached from different fronts, and I think that we need to continue to focus on this work. And secondly, we always complain about governors and mayors, but here we're actually acknowledging. Also, Felipe talked about harnessing the benefits of migration, and there's so many examples that he mentioned. And the experience of regulators also reminds us of the need to clarify regulations so that labor markets work more smoothly. And that's part of our discussion today. Let's now go to Tatiana. Tatiana, we always say that we've seen this shock, this unexpected shock over the course of a few years. Many migrants have gone to several countries in Latin America. When is the right time to plan city and urban expansion? What are the goals of an effective urban expansion plan, and what are the key components that need to be included in the plan for these goals to be achieved? Thank you, Eric. And here with my friends, I'd like to echo the words of congratulations for this report, which is excellent, very practical, and based on very good data. So in response to your question, we at HUD work on the combination of expansion and densification and urbanization. So before I go into expansion, which is of the essence, let me just say that cities in Latin America and the Caribbean, 80% of them are above the global average of 1,500 inhabitants per square kilometer. They are relatively densely populated, but what we've seen over the last few years is that urban centers have been emptied out. The cities have expanded. In 1980, between 1980 and 2010, Mexico City, for example, its population was multiplied by 2, but its urban footprint was reduced. And we need to think in terms of densification. Why? Because otherwise we will not be efficiently using the soil, the ground. In terms of densification, as we just heard from Juan Pablo and Matias, there are some very good recommendations about regulations, incentives to maximize heights, etc. But we also need to work on urbanizing informal settlements that are already there, and we need to make sure that they have access to utilities, to schools, and some basic services. And we need to improve the housing stock that we have. And now going to your question, I wanted to preface this by talking about the importance of leveraging what we have, because all Latin American and Caribbean countries, I mean, their residents live in cities. As to expansion, expansion needs to be a process where we think of demographic density so as to harness the benefits of agglomeration economies that we just heard from in the presentation. We look into what we have in mind is an ongoing planning process. The best recommendations say that you need to have a master plan that is renewed every 10 years and needs to be revised and reviewed every 5 years. But that's for cities. With that said, when you're working on expansion, you focus on specific hubs, on specific areas, and maybe through the partial plan or planning instrument that they have in Colombia, for example, you can think about building, about utilities, basic services, and how to fund these. And at the same time, it allows you to implement many of the regulatory instruments that are there, but in an orderly manner. Now, you need to bear in mind financial or economic elements, such as the efficient use of the soil, and to have agglomeration, but not to a point where they may lead to overcrowding. Also, to be borne in mind are social elements, inclusion. We talked about housing, right? So I can't talk for too long about housing, but the whole concept of expansion needs to include some monitoring of all social groups, not just the real estate market. And here, excuse my Spanglish as well, but and then thirdly, we need to bear in mind environmental issues. For example, pollution, air pollution, water pollution, and adaptation and adjustment to climate change. We promote polycentric models, which have thus far enabled us to have also combined uses in cities, but also have housing, businesses, retail, and sources of employment coexisting in an area. And also transit-centered urban development enables you to connect these hubs quite efficiently and hopefully using electric transportation and transit systems, which will enable you to attain several goals at the same time. And then, so there's the concept of how, and then policies and regulations. And here I would like to say that urban development and creation needs for thought to be given to development instruments and also ground development issues, instruments, and also housing development instruments, and I'm talking about ground use, mixed ground use, and social mixes and combinations, and also make utilities and services the most efficient, water, transit, and have them work more efficiently throughout the city. And I'm sorry for taking so long. I loved what you had to say, because at the end of the day, what you think is these policies are long-term, but they come in tandem. But at the end of the day, it's such a complex problem that you need to approach it from different points of view: housing, employment, etc. So that gives us food for thought as to how to implement these structural policies and what the tools are that we have. Now, going back to Marcela. Marcela, you mentioned some of the innovative work done in the region to include migrants into society, but these policies have not been free of challenges. So what can we do as international organizations to help them succeed? I think that the most important thing to put on the table now is that the most daunting challenges are political in nature. We have the data. Many of you who have studied migration over the last few years know I've devoted the last 15 years of my career to that, and we know that the data were always there. So the issue is public policy, where data and policy are farther apart. This is where it is. And we all know because migration doesn't sell. So there are certain things that we've learned over the last couple of years, politically speaking, as to what works and what doesn't work. And most probably we can, as part of this roundtable discussion, share ideas as to what we've learned. Number one, and this is a piece of advice from President Duque to President Lasso, and he said, if I had done things differently, I wouldn't have brought up the issue. He tried to sell it politically, and he quickly realized that migration does not sell, politically speaking. So working on the policies just pragmatically and not talk about it. but
hasta que empiece
up until it starts yielding benefits, and then telling these success stories of how migrants, as was the case in Peru, as a consequence of their needs and out of need and based on their high qualifications, the high qualifications of Venezuelans that migrated to Peru. Many of them were in the medical profession and were able to validate their diplomas, and they went to the hinterlands and deal with COVID, which is a place where nobody wanted to go. So they were part of the heroes in a major change that happened in Peru. Peru was one of the countries with the highest level of per capita deaths to one of the lowest. So we need to celebrate these stories.
Secondly, we should also aim at the generosity of people rather than pragmatism. 2 years ago, we had a conference on biologically understanding why we reject others so much. We have many communities that will say, no more migrants, we are full. Like New York, with 100,000 migrants and 18 million people. Bogota has 600,000 migrants and 8 million people, so we're not full yet. But it's tapping into generosity, and we have a couple of examples. I remember the ad with Fama, and Venezuelan in Spanish rhymes with brothers and sisters, with hermanos. So it's time to stretch out your hand. And I don't know if you may have heard about Welcome US. This is a public-private organization. You see, the United States doesn't really talk about this, but it has been changing and expanding its legal pathways quite a bit. This humanitarian visa for 30,000 Venezuelans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Cubans every month is a new development, and it is now in the courts. In order to enter the United States, you basically need someone across the border in the States to sponsor you. And Welcome US, when the new 100,000 visas were offered to Ukrainians, led to the need for the sponsors, and 2 million Americans are sponsoring these visas. And in that case, it's one-on-one. You are trying to help someone who's in danger. So that is truly powerful, and we haven't yet found a way to do that in a region. And the third point is about educating the media, which is what we did in Colombia, where we gathered 30 to 40 of the main media outlets to see how the topics could be broached without actually incentivizing xenophobia. If there's crime, you don't need to quote the nationality. For example, in Peru, we're trying to change the regularization policy, trying to provide politicians with a way out. There is crime, we've got to deal with that, but if we regularize the migrants,
salidas retóricas a los desafíos.
In other words, it's about opening up other doors of rhetoric to face the challenges. And we need to celebrate political leaders who make these decisions, which are unpopular in their constituencies. So they need to see a benefit in doing this, and they should be recognized internationally and supported. Because we do believe that there is an opportunity for the Latin American example to be a milestone in terms of managing migration, something we haven't seen in the rest of the world. But this needs support not only in terms of our financing for migration, which is small, but also across the whole range of things we do, because that will define success. Apparently, when problems are complex, it all seems to boil down to the political challenge. So the message is about the political courage. We have the data, We have better diagnoses, and we can argue the case that this offers more benefits than costs. So we may find the incentives for the right politicians to make progress. This is very important. And of course, communication, which also has an impact on the perceptions around migration. And in that vein, Felipe, what can we be done to reduce the negative attitudes as well as discrimination against migrants? And what's the role of an institution like the IDB in supporting governments in this regard? Thanks, Marcela, because you've given me a cue to discuss our favorite subject. Xenophobia is the major silent enemy of giving opportunities in connection with migration and taking advantage of them. The news is that upon the early arrival of foreign migrants in our region, public opinion was very favorable to migration. And now, of course, about 60%, with differences from country to country, you don't see so much receptiveness to migrants. This has happened in other parts of the world, and it's happening here too. There's three good news. First, we've got the information. We've launched a laboratory on perception and observation at the Migration Unit, and we have the analysis from national international surveys and also social and other experiments in 9 countries using hard facts and also other details. And there are tools that help you change the narrative in the short term. The longer term work has to do with schools, which is the specific setting to work and seek to change these messages. But I'd like you all to know that we now have a laboratory that is working on understanding this. And the laboratory also can measure what Marcela referred to, the media, which are the main vehicles for disseminating these processes. And there's 3 ideas we've been working on. One is citizen security. The recent report shows that the main trigger for xenophobic discussions here has to do with this perceived link between migration and crime. But the fact is that this is not borne out by data. We are working with FIDE Colombia and another organization. We expect to launch this early next year. And the data doesn't show that migrants have a greater tendency to commit crime than locals. So there is a major distortion between the perception of the process and reality. And this has to do with bias. And of course, as Marcela said, naming the nationality has to do with it. There was a great experiment in Germany where newspapers couldn't state the nationality of the criminals. And in one specific state, the nationality was mentioned. This was the time of a major Syrian migrants inflow to Germany. And what they did was look at the reactions in that particular state. And of course, there were foreign criminals, but there were also local criminals. And in that particular state, where the newspaper started quoting the nationality, the negative perception around foreign criminals decreased. Because you see, this happens in Colombia and Venezuela as well, and in other countries, when the criminal is a national, the nationality is not specifically stated. So there are tools you can work on. And another second point, this is not related to the lab, but it is a fact. People are concerned that migrants coming in will take away jobs. And our studies show that this is not the case. And there is some tension, especially in the case of the more informal workers, but there's no major impact in the long term. And then there's the role of women in the process. Local women seem more afraid in the presence of migrants' inflow, but there are also negative impacts on women migrants. They have more difficulty accessing jobs. So you need to work with the media, with governments, to come up with ways to communicate and to try try and counter these processes, because most myths are based on false beliefs around the world, and this prevents us from harnessing the potential of migrants. Excellent thoughts. And xenophobia is not such a silent enemy. And of course, we need to change those perceptions as part of the effort of debunking myths to reflect the true situation of migrants and the impact they may have on our countries. In this vein and on planning, Tatiana, what examples can you think of in Latin America and the Caribbean in terms of providing solutions to adequately plan city growth?
La verdad es que existen muy buenos
Actually,
ejemplos en
there are good examples in the region,
uno de los
and I think
los trazos más importantes es esa
one of the main features has to do with the continuity in policies and
que pasan de una administración
investments
a otra.
across administrations. So if I were to choose one city, I would pick Curitiba. As you know, Brazilian cities have responsibilities in terms of planning, housing, and also labor markets. So this may spotlight several of the issues we saw in the report. Between 1965 and 85, Curitiba basically trebled its population, and most migration was internal, either from smaller cities from Paraná state or from rural areas. It was a city that had grown well, but all of a sudden everything went out of control, and in the mid-70s they started to launch a competition, a tender, to see how they were going to manage. The first aim was to have more densification, orderly planning, and number two is orderly planning. The third point was that they wanted to have arrangements and urban developments where there would not just be housing, but also economic activity, because if not, you would just have sleeper cities. And this tender, this competition, led to very good results and launched a transit-oriented development and human development model, that's it. And also, there was a number of major housing solutions that were envisaged. In fact, Brazil makes it possible to set aside land for social housing in centrally located areas, and also consortiums started to develop also to add value, bringing social housing into the city center. And over time, they've also led in terms of PPPs, which by using vacant lots or underused buildings, they have opened up opportunities for social housing, and depending on the number of units available, you can set aside a certain number of units for inclusionary zoning, as is the case in the States. Also, Curitiba has very much focused on putting citizens at the center of action. And all of the development that has taken place has led to quality public spaces with green spaces that we try to preserve, including opportunities to ensure active mobility through bicycle lanes or walkable spaces as well. So if I had to pick one, that would be an example. There are many good ones in the region. And I think one of the great tensions we face has to do with the fact that, as mentioned earlier, housing policies are not necessarily aligned with urban development policies due to the lack of coordination across government levels and ministries, but it can be done. And this is a very clear example. Great. We Latinos are usually highly self-critical, but we also need to advertise our good lessons and good experiences, and this is a great example, Curitiba.
We're almost out of time, but I'd still like to hear just a few final words, if you had to add to what you have just said, or just a final message for those of us here with us in person or online. There are so many of them. Go ahead. Tatiana. I'd just like to reinforce what I said towards the end, that we are self-critical, that we do use the lessons of the past and we think about what we haven't done well in the region. But this is an area where there's some good examples. However, history is in the making. So this can be turned around either way. So good integration policies in Brazil, for example, interiorização, and Colombia, 10 years of TPIS, and Peru, validation of degrees. That's unprecedented, but the largest countries are doing it. So that's typically the migration of the commons. It's a problem of the commons. That if we all do this burden sharing, then this will become a success story. But this could quite easily turn around and have us all start building barriers, and we'll end up with a whole different story of slums around the borders, as opposed to what we're seeing, which is a major economic dividend from integration. But this, of course, hinges on this organization, this institution, and all of the countries that can support those brave people who are reading the report. Thank you, Marcela. And Felipe, two messages. Number one, we do have the capability and we do have the evidence that this is an opportunity in terms of the demographic dividend and productivity for cities. That is where change will occur. And we clearly need to improve our ability to have this evidence become widespread and mass consumed. I do not want to flog ourselves about what has been done wrong. There is an opportunity ahead of us. But let's end on a positive note. As Marcela was saying, when I go to international meetings and we look at the world, Latin America is an example, a role model around the world in terms of migration and policies. And we, the bank, with partners such as USAID, can help governments stay on that path, which is politically costly, but does bring about benefits over the medium term. Thank you, Felipe. And in closing, I would like to reaffirm the fact that Latin American cities do have a huge potential, and also the ability to absorb both internal and international migrants. And cities are centers for creation, but we need to lend political support through planning and to maximize their potential. Thank you, Tatiana. With that, we will close. I'd like to thank all three speakers for this very enlightening discussion that has left us with so many ideas and has paved the way towards a much more in-depth discussion and work to help cities. Thank you, Matias, Juan Pablo, Paul, Antonella, for their help, and the authors of this report, and all of you who joined us here in person, and the hundreds of people who joined us online and listened to us. So once again, there are no excuses. Download the reports. It's available in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, and we will meet again soon. Thank you so much.